Hi, welcome to my lecture today on basic principles and concepts of graphic design. So what I'm going to do is talk about a general discussion of style and two ways we can think about style, and that's how I'll structure what I'm talking about here today. So what are the two ways we're going to define style? And why am I starting with that basic concept? Well, because there's two ways of thinking about it. One is that we can think about style as some just fundamental decisions that we make or approaches that we make about graphic design. And the other is the individual decisions that we make on a given layout, like on a given page or a page spread. So let's talk about this first category first, the fundamental decisions that we make about design. Okay. Well, two concepts here that I want you to think about. One is style versus substance. And the other is, let's call it grid space. And this has to do with basic decisions about what kind of a page or what kind of a medium you're going to be producing a design for and how you use that space. Okay? So we'll call that your grid space. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But let's deal first with just this whole issue of style versus substance. So obviously with graphic design, you're thinking about visual attractiveness, the power of your visual communication. But one of the important issues to think about carefully is what decisions you make that are purely stylistic that have to do with kind of your artistic style versus when that can sometimes get in the way of communicating clearly. So because we're really doing graphic design for mass communication and for journalism, you really want to make sure that your style doesn't get in the way of your substance. Okay? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me show you guys some examples. Because you see this a lot with graphic design in a lot of the magazine industry going on right now. Like if you look, for example, at GQ magazine, you see them doing a lot of things that are basically cool maybe, or they're done for artistic reasons, but they don't necessarily turn out to be all that clear in terms of what it is they're trying to communicate. So for example, this right here would be one example. Okay, so maybe you think, okay, that looks not bad, but it might be a little bit confusing. All right. What about this? Does that get a little bit confusing? Okay. Let's take a look at a couple of the ones from Esquire. Okay. So here's one these are called infographics, the kind of things I'm showing you here. But here's one that's, I guess, kind of an article or maybe what we would call online, maybe a listicle type of thing. But if you notice, it's not consistent with other kinds of design that's going on here. So it's just this page that they're going with this. And then if we go to a little bit further down, things could start getting even weirder. Like for example, this. Why is this headline like this? Why is it cut off like that at the bottom? And then it kind of carries over here like this. Okay? Now, obviously they're doing that for stylistic effect, but as I'm saying, that can sometimes run into the issue of clear communication. Or look at this. We might call these drop caps, which is when you make a big letter at the beginning of a section, but it's a little bit of an odd drop cap. Okay? You can see it again with this E here. So maybe you think that's fine, but just to point out the contrast, look at the layout in a more sort of traditional news magazine like Time magazine. Okay, so here's an issue of Time. And I'll just show you one simple contrast. So look at the cover, the front of this magazine article, okay? Or this layout. Very simple, very straightforward, easy to use, okay? So there's style when we're talking about those kind of stylistic issues, okay? And then I wanted to talk to you about what I'm calling grid space, okay? And again, that's just, for lack of a better word for it, maybe the medium for which that we're using. Whether we're using a phone or a billboard, or we're creating for a brochure or a newspaper. So all of these have different surfaces and different grid spaces, okay? So to give an example, if I'm designing for my phone, I know it's going to be just this big, which is a small space. I mean, compare that to like a billboard. Or I might want to design for the phone so that it turns out best looking like this, okay? I may be wanting to design for something that's this size, okay? Or we often, have these screens, whether it's the computer monitor, which again is more like this type of a shape of a rectangle, or a flat screen television, okay? If you look at some of the decisions that are made about grid space for newspapers, there's an old concept with newspapers called above the fold, okay? So like, for example, this is a design that's for above the fold, okay? But if at the same time, as much as the designers are thinking about what's going to be fit above the fold, they're also looking at this as part of their grid space. So this design is something that is integrated for the whole thing, okay? Now think about, and let me see if I can show you, here again, we have above the fold, but then more or less, the whole newspaper page like this is integrated so that this part of the design fits well with what's going on here. And they're thinking about both. They're thinking what's above the fold, but also down here. If you think about, like, for example, designing for a brochure, so a brochure is going to look something like this maybe, right? So here's the cover to the brochure. Maybe they're designing something that's for that. Maybe they're designing something that's for this whole thing, but maybe each one of these individual spaces is a design in itself. This is the back of the brochure, so if this is the front and this is the back, they may have a design that works like that, or simply a contrast between front and back. So all of those are different things to think about in terms of grid space. And then when you think about how they go ahead and design for magazines, one of the issues is that when you're sending it off to the printer, you have to make sure that the whole design works together and that you're clear with the printer about what works with what. So there's a lot of design concepts that are embedded in, say, creating a magazine. So like, for example, what they'll always do, what you really need to do if you want to create a magazine, is make sure that you have all the pages right. So they'll take a bunch of pieces of paper like this and create something called a dummy. And what they'll do is they'll have a cover to the dummy, okay, and they'll write on that, maybe just to keep track of it all, cover. Okay, and then the back. And then the way that they bind the magazine may be really important. So they may, if they bind it with just a simple staple, then what they're going to have in the middle here is what's called a natural spread. So if this was just connected with a staple, there'd really be no space that you wouldn't be able to see in the middle. So this would be the best big spread space that they'd have for the entire magazine. Now, spaces like this, okay, if they're doing it with even with a staple, you may lose some of what you can see here, okay? So what you have is, this is called the gutter right here in between the space, and a lot of this ends up getting obscured because of a binding. So if you had a binding that was like this, you know, that was thicker, it wasn't simply a staple, a bunch of this might be obscured, okay? And then another thing that they keep, the term that they use for this kind of design is called a bleed, right? So you want the colors and the design to bleed all the way to even beyond what people can see. So there's the bleed space, there's the gutter, the natural spread, the dummy, all of these are terms that are important for design. Now, having said all that, I think the final thing to leave you with is the idea that I'm going to create a separate video, a screencast that shows you how to use InDesign, and you're going to be spending pretty much most or all of your time in doing the actual design using this software, Adobe InDesign, okay? But it's important not to be doing all of your design work on the screen and in the software, because you get caught up in the menus and the different functionality of the application, and you begin to lose your sense of actual design. So what I'd really recommend you do is think through some of your concepts for the design. So I'm giving you images to work with, and I'm giving you text to work with, including both headlines and what you call body copy, which is the text for the actual article itself, okay? And before you really start messing with InDesign, it's a good idea to draw what's called a scamp, okay? And that would mean take a piece of paper like this and just sketch out your basic ideas for the design so you can figure out what goes where. Okay, so that's everything about just the broader concept that I wanted to communicate to you guys about style, okay? So style being both style versus substance, the idea of communicating clearly and not letting your sort of artistic flair get in the way of what it is that you're trying to communicate. And secondly, think through your grid space. What are some of the basic decisions about how I'm going to use the space and how different parts of the space work together, okay?